Hello, everyone. Good to be back with you as we continue to look at East Asia origins to 1800. Let's get back to the Qing dynasty, uh, China's last imperial dynasty. And we're calling this talk a Gilded Age. And so think about what the term gilded means and why that might apply here to this period. So we begin at the end of the Kangxi period and the transition to an emperor that we know as the Yongzheng Emperor. Now, the Yongzheng Emperor came to power. He was one of the sons of Kangxi. Kangxi had actually chosen a different son as his heir, but ultimately found him to be unsuitable, thought that he was corrupt, and in fact, in 1713, he basically places him under house arrest for the remainder of his life. There are other machinations and accusations associated with Yongzheng's coming to power in 1722, and he reigns for 13 years. This is a period when a lot happens. Now, here you've got a representation of him as quite the activist. He's actually portrayed in a kind of a European hairstyle and whatnot by Castiglione, the Jesuit painter who we met in the last lecture. But he's also depicted as a man of a studious man, somebody who reads, and you have the traditional imperial portrait as well. But one of the striking things about this period was that Yongzheng engaged in several efforts, certainly to improve life for the imperial family. We'll hear about that in just a bit, but also to improve the administration of the empire. And so he reorganizes some of the jurisdictions and tries to tighten controls over the bureaucracy to improve performance in that way. And here you've got an example of this mindset, cherishing the virtuous and loving the people. Now, one might raise questions about sincerity and things like that, but this is from Yongzheng's period. This is a seal that he, in fact, used. And so it speaks to his efforts at administrative change and trying to improve governance. With his passing, however, power flows to the Qianlong Emperor. And the Qianlong Emperor will essentially rule China for the remainder of the 18th century. This is an astonishing stretch. It's a period where China has perhaps 150 million people. Uh, midway through the 18th century, and by the end of the century, perhaps as many as 300 million people. And we'll see how that comes about. Partly it's through standard population growth, not extremely fast population growth. 1% per year would double the population in 72 years. So that's not, uh, uh, you know, ex, explosive population growth that we would see in the modern period, but it's steady population growth. And part of this growth comes from expanding the empire. And in expanding the empire, you also have more people brought under your jurisdiction, many of them Muslims during this period, but also you have the opening of new lands. Now, one of the striking things is the very deliberate way that the Qing state during the Qianlong period seeks to portray the emperor and seeks to assert its uh, its reach. And so in this one particular location, you have the establishment of essentially a Tibetan Buddhist temple. Now, this is within within China proper, Wu Taishan. But here you had the Shunzhi Emperor, you had also the Kangxi Emperor, but this will be carried still further by during the Qianlong period. And here he's portrayed as a bodhisattva, but later, in fact, he will take on a role that is equivalent to the role of a Buddha, an enlightened being. But here in this particular portrayal. Now, here we have the imperial armor, right? And we saw this with Kangxi in the last lecture. But one of the striking things is across the visor for the emperor, you have the claim of being a universal ruler. Now, this is in Sanskrit, and you have the similar sorts of things suggested in the Qianlong Emperor's tomb, something that he actually oversaw the building of that's outside of Beijing, and you can visit it today. He is there together with two empresses and three consorts. But again, it's the suggestion that this ruler is not just the ruler of the Qing Empire, but a universal ruler, wherever what, for all things under heaven. Now, like his grandfather, the Kangxi emperor, Qianlong will go on inspection tours, and here we have southern, images from that trip to the south, where you leave Beijing to go and see these other areas and to make sure that things are as you want them to be. And so here you've got another example of of a southern style building that is now part of the Peabody Museum in New England. Now, the Kangxi emperor was active. He was an accomplished archer. So is the Qianlong emperor. Here we have several demonstrations of him out on the hunt. In this particular case, hunting a rabbit, but in other cases, hunting deer, shooting at them with, bow and arrow from horseback, going at fast speed. Again, the Manchus prided themselves on these two skills, horsemanship and archery. And you saw this also in the imperial palaces that they built outside of Beijing, where they would go so that they could ride horses, so that they could practice these skills. Now, the Qianlong emperor is also the first emperor to use gunpowder in a gun. Others had used gunpowder, of course, for cannons and the like. But here we have a representation of the Qianlong emperor using a musket. And these were prepared for him by the imperial workshop based on models that they imported from the outside. A recent example of this, of one of these from the Qianlong period, went on auction and sold for a couple $1 million when it was sold in 2016. Now, one of the impressive features of the capital during the Qianlong period, during any period, was this Yuanmingyuan. This is the Garden of Perfect Brightness that's built out in the outskirts of Beijing. And it was begun by Kangxi and by Yongzheng, but the key builder is the Qianlong emperor. He's the one who expands it so dramatically. It's huge, 3.5 square kilometers, right? Much bigger than the imperial palace to be found in the center of Beijing today. And again, you have these representations set in the mountains, set with water features, a lake, a stream, these kinds of things. Now, here we've got various schematics, and you can see the different parts of the garden. One of the areas that has gotten a lot of attention was added near the end. In 1747, the Qianlong emperor had some of his Jesuit assistants design this part of the garden. And they came up with all sorts of things with the inspiration from France, because, of course, this is the age of, of Versailles. And so you have that example that is replicated by these Jesuits in in Beijing. And so, most famously, you've got this water feature where you have the 12 animals of the Chinese zodiac, and water spurts out through their mouths into this water feature. But it's really quite extraordinary, and it's a place that I visited in the 1980s. You can only see ruins today because it was smashed. It was destroyed in the middle of the 18th century by invading British, middle of the 19th century, sorry, by invading British and French soldiers. And so you have these examples. It was widely known because the Jesuits, of course, are passing information back to Europe. What an extraordinary place had been built. Now, some of the things from Yuanmingyuan have come up for auction. And so this is one of these two of these zodiac heads. And when they've come up for auction more recently, Chinese companies have purchased them so as to return them to China. But you have an example here of this imperial clock where the hands are parts of the dragon. And you've got the inscription of great fortune on the clock itself. An extraordinary thing. And during the Qing dynasty, you have such creativity and such high levels of artistic achievement. These are works that were collected by the imperial family, by wealthy families within China, but in some cases exported to European markets. You have this amazing lacquerware. You have the jade carvings, exquisite technique. These are very small, but very, very detailed. Look at this, this bit of ceramic here, happiness teapot. You've got this vase on the right. And of course, the imperial family, the emperor, wore the imperial gold with the emperor right in the center. And you could tell an official's rank by what was on his robe. And so you have this exquisite embroidery present here. Of course, this is also a period where what is now called Beijing opera comes to the fore, and you have different performances. Now, one of the things that you see here is the so-called Monkey King, and this, of course, is based on this famous novel from the Ming Dynasty, Journey to the West, which has been turned into films, television series, and things like that, but also these operatic performances. And Beijing Opera, if you haven't had the privilege of watching this, you might want to check something out on YouTube. Often it has acrobatics, you have elaborate dress, and of course, music. Now, one of the things that gets produced during the Qianlong reign, but isn't widely consumed at that point, is this famous novel, the most famous Chinese novel, Story of the Stone or Dream of Red Chamber, Hong Lo Meng, as every Chinese knows, and every Chinese has consumed this in some form or fashion, often through reading it, but also through television versions of it, comic book versions of it. In the 18th century, when it was first produced by Cao Shuiqian, it wasn't packaged and distributed by him. He shared it with others who did take different parts of it and reproduce it, and they read it and consumed it in that way. Later, Gala will put that together. He will add some chapters, and you'll have a full version that comes into being. But it's still being consumed today because of uh, many people appreciate the exquisite language, and certainly in the movie and television versions, the high production values, things like that. But the story also has a lot of meaning for audience through the generations, focusing as it does on the pressures to conform, the pressures to meet family expectations in marriage and in career. And so the central character is expected to succeed in the examination system and essentially, take care of the family by becoming an official, which is a highly paid position. But he's not really interested in those things. His interests are quite different. And you also have one particular woman who he's drawn to, but his family has a different partner for him in mind. This kind of issue, the confrontation between self, individual choice, individual preferences versus those set by society, those set by one's family. So your students might appreciate, reading this in translation. There are a number of them available, and you could access this, or you could just show them a couple minutes from a YouTube clip. Other amusements, of course, you had traveling musicians. Now, this is not a prestigious position in those days. People appreciated entertainment, but people tended to look down on entertainers, even though they might develop a following. And so here you've got a couple of different performers, storytellers, musicians, sword swallowers, hacky sack players. So this is a kind of amusement for folks. So here, let's pause and take a moment to think about High Qing. When we talk about this is the height of the Qing dynasty, the next century, the 19th century, is going to be filled with all sorts of trauma. And of course, ultimately ends with the dynasty teetering, and it will topple at the beginning of the 20th century. But this period is often depicted as High Qing, and we'll talk about the expansion of the realm in just a moment, but you've had some exposure to the cultural attainments, this sort of thing. So think too about how the emperor gets represented. Why choose to use a Sanskrit term meaning universal ruler, right? Supreme ruler. Why choose something along these lines? And then, of course, think about what is represented by this imperial palace. This was not something that was enjoyed by others. Yuan was reserved for the imperial family, but it was a place of remarkable beauty. And interestingly enough, it's a mix of Chinese norms as well as Western imports. And this, of course, happens in the 18th century, not something that's just happening today. Now, we mentioned the expansion of this realm, and we see that very clearly on this map. Now, you've seen this map in the previous lecture as well, and you can see that during the Kangxi period, a lot of the Qing Empire is solidified, including you've obviously got Inner Mongolia taken by the Manchus early on, but also Outer Mongolia, and the expansion into some Muslim areas during the Kangxi realm period, when he will personally challenge Galdan, the leader of these areas. But during the Qianlong period, the empire adds almost an equal amount of territory to the existing empire. These vast areas of the Northwest and including Tibet, bringing Tibet under control as a protectorate. Now, at this time, you've got the British paying attention in India, but also in Nepal, and you'll have some confrontation there. The Qing will actually send an army and threaten Kathmandu, the capital of Nepal, during this period. And so during the Qianlong reign, you have tremendous expansion against difficult enemies. And so this also suggests the competency of the government during a large portion of this period, the ability to mobilize resources and send them great distances to conquer new lands. Now, with the acquisition of new lands, not all of this is great farmland, but some of it is. And by having vast areas, you're able to provide additional space for Chinese farmers. So you have population growth moving into these areas. Now, here we have a couple of representations. Now, these are a mix of Chinese and European styles because they were designed, sketched out in China, and then they had French engravers produced prints, and they weren't widely distributed in Europe. They were consumed, and these particular ones come from the Palace Museum in Beijing. But there are also versions that are held in the French National Library. But here, the presentation of prisoners to the emperor to show the conquest, and then the celebration with this victory banquet. And this is part of a whole series highlighting these battles in the middle of the 18th century. Again, showing the huge success of the empire, the richness that you could have this particular imperial boat, in one of the as part of the Southern tour. Here again, highlighting the battle against a minority group, the Miao, and the confrontation there. And note the presence of guns. To the best of our knowledge, they didn't actually have guns. This is some artistic license. Guns certainly existed, but they weren't highly mobile and difficult to use, and not important in battle at this time. They, of course, would become decisive later on. Now, China was an agrarian society, an agriculture-centric economy. You had a lot of manufactured products, you had a lot of handicrafts, tremendous textile production, things like this. But the core economic activity for the vast majority of people, over 90% of the people, was what? Growing things or animal husbandry, things along these lines, as kind of a core economic activity. And for a time, you're bringing new lands into production. And for a time, you can apply fertilizer to some of these lands. And the main fertilizer that was used, of course, was human and animal waste, but also soybeans. And soybeans raised in the Northeast were shipped throughout the empire and turned in the soybean cake was used as a kind of fertilizer. But at a certain point, agriculture production, meaning the amount that you could produce on a unit of land, started to hit a plateau, especially in the most intensively cultivated areas around the Yangtze Delta near present day Shanghai. So how can households survive when their land, you can't coax more out of the land and you don't have more land to farm? So what did they do? They got part-time jobs. They worked on somebody else's land. Some rich person who didn't work the land himself would hire somebody to come and work it. Or they might work in construction, they might work in trade, they might do things along these lines. When we talk about handicraft production, what we're talking about here is kind of manufactured goods, but manufactured by hand. Okay, so here we're talking about spinning, uh, spinning cotton into thread and weaving that into cloth. We're talking about doing the same thing with silk. We might be talking about doing other kinds of handicraft production. Commerce, of course, buying and selling, or just working as labor carrying goods. And we have several images to highlight this. And so here you've got somebody who works for this better off person, and he's taking this person together with the pig to market, right? You've got another person who's working here with a saw, building something. You've got people hauling stuff. You've got women who might have worked, as housekeepers for better off families, doing all kinds of things just to survive. The spinning again of cotton into thread, and then the weaving of it into cloth. And so you're doing all of these things, even though your wage may not, what the value that you generate with this may not be large, but every little bit helps. Just as some of your students, in fact, may come home from school and then do something in a family business to help, not necessarily as formal work, but just to increase product. Here you've got somebody moving tobacco, and tobacco becomes one of these items that gets traded, a merchant there. Now, what we want to highlight here is that the economy grows during this 18th century. It grows partly through bringing new land under cultivation, partly through population growth, applying more labor, and by doing that, you increase total output. And so that's growth. That's growth. And that means that, there weren't such statistics back then, but the national gross output, the gross domestic output, gross domestic product would have been rising. But if all you're doing is adding labor, and that labor doesn't become more productive, but in fact just works longer hours. It's not using new tools, new technology to produce more per day. It's just putting in extra days. That's growth. That's not economic development. Economic development is different because economic development represents getting more output for each labor input. And so productivity matters. And so as long as you're doing things the old way, and maybe not increasing production because you're not moving into new territory, and in fact you have the law of diminishing returns, on the land that you have, that's you may increase total output, but you are not producing more per day. And what matters in terms of living standards is increasing output per day, economic development by applying new technology, new ways of doing things. That way, you can raise economic output faster than population growth. And that's what's key to higher living standards. That's also what's key to what? Military success. And that's what we see happen in Northern Europe at this time, right? Where you start to have the application of machinery in textiles and other things that leads to greater productivity. It's not without pain, but it changes the world economy. So think about how you might talk with students about this to contrast the words that are often used interchangeably. We often use growth and development as synonyms, but in this specific context, they ought to be seen as distinct and talk with students about the key factor of productivity in terms of increasing output, increasing wages, increasing income, improving living standards. China then and now was a big exporter, and there was desire then for all sorts of goods from China, primarily luxury products, certainly silks, porcelains, other things, but also, of course, tea is a big item. And so the British wanted to sell other things, but they were constrained. The Portuguese had Macau to do business. The Dutch would do business, for a time until the Qing will push them, or until um, uh, Kongshiga will drive them out of Taiwan. But they will be in Indonesia and they'll do business with Chinese traders this way. So goods from China are part of the global trade. But the Qing will limit the access for most foreigners, not for the Russians, not for the Japanese. They have other access points. But for the British and for the Americans, a little bit later, they will limit access to this artificial island in the Guangzhou harbor. And so if you want to buy tea, that's where you have to go. And so here we have paintings showing some of the tea dealings, the demands. Now, what else was being purchased? Well, you were purchasing these elaborate cabinets. What you might buy would be this Nanking fabric. Now, what were later in the century, the first American traders arriving in China, they were bringing things like ginseng, rensheng. They would be bringing ginseng from America to sell in China. And so you had this kind of trade. You had all sorts of it. And so these are from the Palace of Versailles. And so here you've got a portrait of the Qianlong Emperor on the left at the Palace of Versailles, from and produced in about 1776. And then you have these porcelain plates used at the palace by the French ruling family, imperial family, and these are produced in China as well. And they are today in the museum of the Palace of Versailles. Now, the Chinese wanted to restrict this trade. And so, if you wanted to do business with China, you had to do business with a select number of merchants. And of course, the British and others were a little frustrated. They thought, well, if we could sell more broadly, maybe we could get better prices. Maybe we could find a market for some of our goods. And so they chafed at this. Quite famously, there was a so-called Flint episode where you had a British fellow who learned Chinese, had a couple of Chinese teachers, and wrote a memorial calling on the Qianlong Emperor to allow for this kind of thing. His teachers were executed because they had taught him Chinese. The Qing were going to have trade, but only on their terms. They wanted to control that. Well, near the end of the Qianlong period, you had a British embassy that was sent. And so you had this fellow, Lord George Macartney, who was sent by King George to go to China and to meet with the emperor and to see if they could establish a wider basis for trade. And you have access to uh, some of the back and forth in the readings that you have in the discussion forum. And so the Chinese didn't want this to happen. They knew it was going to happen. They had the Dutch and others telling them the British are coming, the British are coming. You ought to do business with us. We're a lot more accommodating. We don't try to push you to do things that you don't want to do. But in any case, McCartney comes and has this journey from the south, from present day Guangzhou up to not to the imperial palace in Beijing, but to this other imperial establishment up in the hills, Chengde, which was a favorite place because it was cooler during the summer. It was spacious. You could ride horses. You could do things like this. And the Qing dynasty built several different palaces out at Chengde. And eventually, the McCartney embassy reaches and meets with the emperor. It's not successful. There was a lot of debate between the British and the Chinese even before they came, because the Chinese are saying, okay, if you come, you have to koto, you have to kowtow to the emperor. We all do. This is the norm. The Portuguese have had to do it. You should do that. And the British are saying, no, we don't do that. And finally, they come to an agreement that as long as McCartney does what he would do for King George, that would be considered acceptable. But despite the gifts, despite the journey, the Qianlong Emperor says, "You're doing okay managing that little place you have so far away. Keep that up. But you don't need to come here. And we don't need any of the things that you brought. We have everything in abundance and in high quality ourselves. And so don't bother us again." And so this is the brush off for the McCartney mission. And so this is how it gets portrayed, by some of the critics in Britain, right? Here you have the Qianlong emperor, and you've got various things and trying to appeal, and the Chinese, the Manchu rulers of the Qing Empire are not impressed, not impressed. You can bring balloons, you can do all that. We are not going to be impressed. 2 decades later, there's another mission, equally unsuccessful, and in fact, even more problematic. And we talk about that in the second semester or the second seminar focusing on East Asia. But one of the things that we need to be mindful of is, although this is High Qing, although the cultural achievements are tremendous, the expansion of the empire is remarkable, you start to see cracks, and you start to see that maybe this is a gilded age, meaning gold on the outside, maybe not gold inside. And so you start to see that with the White Lotus rebellions that break out near the end of the Qianlong period. Now, the Qianlong emperor, after 6 decades, abdicates, formally abdicates. And this is out of respect for his grandfather, the Kangxi emperor, who had ruled for 6 decades. He doesn't want to exceed that. He doesn't want to presume to exceed that. And so he abdicates in favor of his son. But the reality is he holds on to power. Inside the palace, they still refer to this as the Qianlong reign, the Qianlong period. He still makes all these decisions. He even writes down, "I could certainly not give up authority," particularly because this rebellion has started in 1796. Now, uh, this uprising had religious connections, but it was also, of course, tied to, uh, you know, drought and hunger and other problems that drove people in this direction. The White Lotus, this is an amalgam of Buddhism and Taoism. You have the idea of the Maitreya Buddha. You also have the idea of this eternal mother, and you can see a portrayal of the eternal mother, this Wusheng Lao Mu, on the wall in the image before you. This is supposedly the Qing dynasty officials breaking up one of these secret sects. And religious inspired uprisings and disorder had been a problem for dynasties going back to the Han dynasty. All right. So this was not a new development, but it was something that the empire was concerned about. And of course, the Chinese government today remains concerned. And so the rebellion breaks out, and you can see it's in south central China. And it's several different rebellions. That's why I've labeled it this way. It's not thoroughly coordinated and this sort of thing. But it's noteworthy that the governor of Shanxi province, in fact, says, here's the problem. You can't tell who's friendly, who's not. And so you essentially are running into the difficulty that every insurrection poses. How do you tell the rebels from the people who are loyal to you? How do you distinguish? And so Hu Shiran, he proposes, and it eventually succeeds, this notion of clearing the countryside. So basically, you force uh, you force ordinary villagers who are considered loyal, you take them out of their villages and you build essentially these palisaded, secured locations that can be defended. But also the idea is to cut off the rebels from being able to link up with the village to get sustenance, to hide, to do these kinds of things. But it's a long struggle and it's an expensive one. The empire spends 120 million ounces of silver on this, an unprecedented expenditure, equal to several years of the national budget to try to extinguish this. Now, this happens, it starts while Kangxi is the emperor, technically he has abdicated, but before he passes in 1799. After he passes, the his son will in fact take take this fellow He Shen and blame him for all sorts of things, in part because He Shen had treated him badly. He Shen operated essentially as the right hand, the loyal right hand of the emperor, but he also operated in a milieu of great corruption, and he accumulated all sorts of resources. And what's been documented was, for example, a lot of the resources that would be set aside for the military to meet their needs, he would siphon some of that off. He wasn't alone; other people were doing it too. But it meant that when the rebellion breaks out, and in trying to fight the rebellion, you had what? Starved military. This is his home in Beijing. After it was seized in 1799, it will wind up becoming an important place in later years. It's known today as the Prince Gong Mansion, and all kinds of holdings that he possessed. He was the second richest person in the world, second only to the Qianlong Emperor. But he is forced to commit suicide by the Qianlong Emperor's son, who will not have him around anymore. And so his life comes to an end in 1799. He had risen very quickly from being a palace guard to being a grand counselor, an aide to the emperor. Now, here we have two venerable individuals. We have the Qianlong Emperor on the left, who passes away in 1799. You have George Washington on the right. He also passes away at a younger age, but also in 1799. We know, for example, that Washington gives these famous speeches. He removes himself from power. He doesn't run for a third term, and so his term of office ends in 1797, and he lets go, and he warns people about the dangers of polarization and political parties and things like that. But he passes from the scene. He's somebody who could have made himself a king. He was so very important to the revolution. On the other hand, we have the Qianlong Emperor, who reigns for 6 decades, and in fact, 63 years, right? Even after he has formally abdicated, he's still in command up until the time of his death. And he had no uncertainty about his performance. He, in fact, quite famously wrote about 10 perfect victories and, wanted people to understand that he was mistake free. He had never erred, and that under his rule, the Qing Empire was really a glowing, a glowing space. Something to consider, something for us to think about. Once again, we have this chart showing the late imperial period, and I'd like you to think about, again, this question of being open, being closed, how you do business with others, how you treat others, how you exploit others, how you bring in their talent, those kinds of things. The question of economic change. China has the world's largest economy at this time. And in fact, it has the largest manufacturing economy, although that's going to change in the 19th century. It's already begun to change at the end of the 18th century. And then how you present the past. What is the place, of the state? And certainly you have the Qing rulers trying to manage their image, the story that is told about them, but also how do we teach about this? Often the Qing dynasty is portrayed as kind of closed and not open to innovation, things like that. But it lasted for a long time. The Qing Empire, of course, is established in 1644 and will last until 1911, right? It was in its third century. Well, the American enterprise is also in its third century. Let's think about what the Qing represented, a Manchu dynasty that was the largest in the world at its time. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to our discussion.